The theme of today's sermon is change. And the question that I have to ask is change possible? And the answer to that question is yes. So now, as I pointed out earlier today, you got the question, you got the answer, sermon's over. Can you change the world? Sure. But the point that I make with that I think is really important is that a lot of times people don't really understand that they can change the world. They can change themselves. They can change circumstances in their life. And because of that, they get locked into this idea. So now you've got the answer. You can change. Change is possible. Problem is that change is very, very difficult and sometimes extremely painful for a lot of people. And yet this has been recognized for a very long time, as is implied by the words of Heraclitus, a great Greek philosopher from back 2,500 years ago, when he said this. This is an actual quote. There is nothing permanent except change. There's nothing permanent except change. You see, change is the natural order of the universe. And some of us have difficulty with that, especially some of us that have come from more traditional backgrounds where we're taught from the Bible that says, God created the heavens and the earth, looked at it, said, it's good. And in the minds of many people, that is, it's done, it's over, it's finished, that's the way it is. Now, accommodate to it. But the fact of the matter is, the creation might be done insofar as the pattern has been established and the process has been begun. But it is an evolutionary process that continues on and on and on and on. And as far as I know, there's no end in sight. I don't think I'll be around to see it even if there is. You know, we've got in modern scientific discoveries going way back, it's become very clear that the universe is a constantly changing phenomenon. I'm always amused, just pops into my mind, how we get so much into how we want to keep everything the way that... I'm an environmentalist, by the way. I really believe in conserving the resources of the earth. And at the same time, it's always seemed like puzzling to me that we environmentalists want to consider everything in the way that is most useful to conserve it, except us. You ever think about that? We do not include ourselves in this process. But we're part of the process, and we are going to change. There are other things that are going to change. There are species that are going to be disappearing. There are new species that are going to be coming on. It's always changing. And it changes according to some basic pattern, the nature of which I don't really understand very much. But it's ongoing, ongoing, ongoing. And it's wonderful. It's wonderful because there are all kinds of possibilities that come out of it. And we don't have to wait eons of time to see what the next species of horse is going to be. All we have to do is keep our eyes open, pay attention, and we begin to see that there are new things showing up all the time and new opportunities, new possibilities for every one of us. Change is the order of the universe. And yet we resist it. Why do we resist it? At least I have resisted it. Maybe nobody else here has ever resisted change. But I'm going to tell you about the kinds of things I've experienced in my resistance to change. I think at least one of the reasons that we tend to resist change is that we do have an ego attachment to things being the way that they are. This is the human conditioned mind that I'm talking about when I talk about ego attachment. And then the human conditioned mind says, this is the way it is, and this is the way I want to keep it, and this is the way it's going to be. And so I've got to be right. And if I've got to be right, then change just doesn't fit into that scenario, does it? Having to be right is one of the ways we resist change. And I could do a whole sermon on that. I'm not going to do that. I've got 2 other sermons I've got to finish before we get to 12 o'clock here. You take that and work with that a little bit. Another way that we tend to resist is very simple. It's a very human kind of a response to things. And that is, it's just uncomfortable to change. You ever noticed how uncomfortable it is to change? And I'm not talking about changing your clothes or your socks. I'm talking about just to change the way you function, the way you relate to life and to other people. It gets uncomfortable. It forces us out of our ruts. And some of us are just plain lazy. We look at what has to be done and we say, oh dear, I'm not sure that I want to undergo that. I have gone through, as I say, I'm not talking about any of you because I know you're all above that. I'm talking about some of the things that I've experienced in life. But you know what's interesting is that people really want to be different from the way they are. And yet they don't want anything to change in order to bring that about. Interesting, isn't it? Story of a young woman, a little farm girl, married and living in this lovely little house with a rocking chair and the quilts and the whole thing. And she went to a craft show. And she saw some needlepoint that she just loved. And so she bought it and she brought it home. It was already framed, a beautiful thing. She hung it on the wall and it said, "Prayer changes things." And it was an inspiration to her because she would walk by it. Every time she'd walk by it, she'd see this and she'd stop a moment and think, yes, prayer changes things. And she'd do a little prayer or a little affirmation about some transformation that she was interested in effecting in her life. And one day she walks through the kitchen, looks up, it's gone. She didn't know what to expect. She didn't know what had happened. That evening when her husband got home, she said, "John, this, by the way, is a true story." She said, "John, did you take down my needlepoint, the one that says prayer changes things?" And he says, "Yes, I did." He said, "Well, why? Don't you believe in prayer? Don't you believe that things can change through prayer?" He says, "Yes, I do believe in prayer, and I do believe that prayer changes things. It's just I don't want things to change, and I don't want to be reminded of that." Isn't that amazing? Can you imagine that really happened? And if it didn't, I mean, I was told that it really happened, and if it didn't, it makes a good story, doesn't it? Because I think it illustrates to us how stuck we can be in certain things. And the place that we really get stuck is in our ideas, our patterns, our concepts. And we hold on to them and we hold on to them. We don't want to let them go. I mean, I know that myself. I grew up in a very traditional religious environment, and there were certain ideas that were just inculcated into me. And when I began to pull away, it was just like there were strings attached. It kept wanting to pull me back. You know? And that happens to a lot of us, doesn't it? Just think about some of those deeply ingrained patterns that take root subconsciously over which or about which we have no real conscious understanding. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? All the more reason to challenge ourselves, to ask ourselves some critical questions, to move beyond those patterns. You ever heard of Max Planck? Some of you have, some of you haven't. He was a great scientist back in the early part of the 20th century, back along in the 1920s and 1930s, in that period of time when there was a revolution going on in science. We're beginning to break away from some of the old ideas, and there was so much excitement about it. There were, the old classical science, and then with the advent of relativity and Einstein photoelectric effect, which is a quantum mechanical effect, and then the formal articulation of some of the ideas that have later become to be known as quantum mechanics. It just tore everything apart. Max Planck formulated a little theory about what he referred to as the wave-particle dualism. Now, I know you want to know all about that, but I'm not going to lecture on that today. The fact of the matter is, the wave-particle dualism really was one of those things that threw science into an upheaval. An exciting period of time for a lot of these forward-thinking, progressive scientists who saw this as an opportunity to begin to explain things that couldn't be explained from the old classical science, and an upheaval insofar as there were others who had their old patterns, their old thoughts, their old ideas, and they're going to be damned to give up on those old ideas. And it was really a conflictual period of time. Is that a word, conflictual? I like it. Anyway, Max Planck was talking to somebody one time, and it was asked, he says, well, how do you account for the incredible amount of resistance that you're having to some of your ideas and ideas of others around this quantum mechanical phenomena being accepted? It's so valid. And he made an interesting comment. He said, no idea, regardless of how valid it is, will ever be accepted until all of the opponents to that idea have died. Interesting, isn't it? But it takes that sometimes. And let me give you an example a little closer to home. You know, Fred Vogt was a great minister. He died about 10 years ago, and he was a dear, dear friend of mine. And at one time, I was very, very active at the international level in our church. Fred was the president. A fellow by the name of Mark Shaw was the CEO, and I was the chairman of the board of trustees. That was the highest elected position in the whole church. And we would get together and we'd brainstorm things. We'd go to meetings and, drink beer together and all the other kinds of things that executives do. Well, we were talking one day, and we were talking about a very particular problem. I call it a problem. See, back in the early 1950s, Ernest Holmes, our founder, convened a meeting in Oklahoma City and brought together the big guns of religious science. And they had some problems. They were trying to resolve differences of opinion. Not on the teaching, not on the belief structure, not on the way we did things relative to our spiritual technology, if you want to call it that way. But there were some administrative things, and there were some big egos involved. So they got together in this meeting, and finally the differences were irreconcilable. And so this movement that is based in unity split. And so we ended up with what became known eventually as the RSI, Religious Science International, and the United Church of Religious Science, which is the body that we went with. That's the one that Ernest Holmes headed up, and they've changed their names since then. But that's what it was. And I remember talking with Fred Vogt and Mark Shaw in this one context years ago. This is 20 years ago or so. And I said to Fred, because he was the old wizened one, he'd been around a long time, he'd seen a lot of changes. I says, do you think there's any possibility, Fred, that we will ever come back together as a church, as a single church, that we will heal whatever the hurts were or the divisions, the things were the cause of division? And he looked at me and he says, there is no possibility that we will ever come back together until there are some well-placed funerals. Interestingly, those well-placed funerals have taken place. And you will probably see within the next year to 18 months the recombining of Religious Science International, or what's called the International Centers for Spiritual Living and the United Centers of Spiritual Living, which we are, coming together as one. Now there'll be all hell breaks loose at that time, because there are going to be the other egos that are involved. And how are we going to say things? What are we going to call ourselves? What is the structure going to be and all that? But we will come back together. But that kind of conflict is what comes up. And that's change. Change brings about these kinds of considerations. And it takes time, and it takes a willingness on our part to work through those things. But we get so stuck in our patterns. A few years ago, I decided to learn how to type. I was absolutely certain I would never need to learn how to type, much less have a computer. Because here I was a young engineer, kind of an executive type, moving into some fancy research and all of that sort of thing. And so I would never need to learn how to type. Well, lo and behold, the time came when not only did I need to learn how to type, but I needed a computer. And I don't know how many computers I've had since then. And I only have 3 in my home right now. When I was learning to type, I learned a little bit about the history of typing. And it goes back into the 1800s. And the first machines that were made were those that many of you may remember. You know, you press on a key and there's a linkage to a little arm that comes up and it has type on the end of the thing and it bangs down onto the piece of paper and it makes the impression. And you have all of these keys, one for every letter plus various characters. And if you got going very fast, sometimes the arms would get mixed up and they'd get bent. And you know what I'm talking about, because many of us have experienced that sort of thing. Well, in order to be able to keep from damaging the machine every time somebody tried to increase their speed beyond what its capability was, they designed a keyboard. And it was called a QWERTY keyboard. And that's because I was told in the first sermons, it's QUWERTY. That's the first line of type, I guess, across the keys. And it's called QWERTY. And it worked fine for a long time. But they had to slow people down. So the design was to separate the most commonly used keys far enough that you really had to work at it. And you still had people who could type at 100 words a minute. I mean, it's kind of incredible, isn't it? Well, as time went on, what happened? We've got more and more advanced designs, and we get into, you remember the IBM Selectric with the little ball that turn around in there? It was an incredible thing. And then there was the Daisy wheel was another design, a competitive design, and all kinds of things. And finally, we have the computer now. It all happens electronically. You can't get ahead of that. But what's the keyboard that we're using? The QWERTY keyboard. The same one that was designed way back in order to be able to control the speed. Now, why haven't they developed a new keyboard? Well, they have. And it was designed about more than 50 years ago. It's called a Dvorak. So the keys are placed in the most advantageous position to be able to reach them. What do you use on your computer or your typewriter? You use QWERTY. What does virtually everybody use? Now, you can buy a keyboard for the Dvorak. It's just a special order kind of a thing. But we continue to use the QWERTY. And I think it's kind of interesting that the Dvorak keyboard, invented 50 years ago, can actually increase the speed of a good typist 5 times. You know somebody that can type 100 words a minute? Can you imagine typing 500 words a minute? I can't imagine it. I don't know how it can be. Fact of the matter is, you can increase your speed an awful lot by this new design. But we still labor on with a system that is designed for inefficiency. Let's take a look at our lives. How many things do we have that we do that are inefficient, and yet there's new technology, there's new awareness, there's new understanding that would allow us to be able to move beyond that. And you know, some people would rather die than to change. I want to talk to you this morning about 3 ways that you might encourage change in your life to help you overcome your resistance to change. And I'm going to give you the 3 right now. Number 1 is the most important, and it's the most conceptually difficult to get because it's deeply metaphysical, and you might want to pay very careful attention to what I have to say, and perhaps you might even want to write this down so you can remind yourself later when you go on. The number 1 thing that will help you to be able to overcome your resistance to change is you got to want to change. Now, I kind of emphasize that because a lot of times people don't really get it. But that's the one thing. If you want to change, really want to change, there's a good possibility you begin to find ways to do that. Unfortunately, the principal motivator for change in most cases, or for a lot of people, is pain. We have to get to the point where the pain is so great that we're no longer willing to live that way. Some of you have heard of a couple of guys from the 1930s who were in such pain. They happened to meet, got to know each other. They were in such pain that they were no longer willing to live the way they were. They were both hopeless drunks. One of them was Bill Wilson and the other one was Dr. Bob Smith. And some of you are nodding your heads, and you've heard of these guys. And they finally worked together. To make a long story short, their history, their story is worth watching. Find out from PBS. They had a wonderful special on this a number of years ago. Bill Wilson and Bob Smith, they got together and they talked and they talked and they drank and they talked and they drank, and little by little they began to find things that were supporting them and staying sober. And the upshot of that, out of their getting together over this long period of time, emerged what we know today as Alcoholics Anonymous. Perhaps one of the most spiritual systems that has ever been devised, not associated with any particular discipline except what they have put together, and it's been absolutely marvelous. But it took a lot of pain, and it took the power of their own intention to move them to an action that ultimately led them to create a system that's kept them sober. And millions of other people have benefited from this. Now, the interesting thing is they shifted from just not wanting to suffer the pain that they had suffered into actually doing something that made a contribution. And this is the second point. We can change when we can find something really significant to which we can give our allegiance, if you will, to which we want to give ourselves, to make a contribution. Friedrich Nietzsche, the great German philosopher back to the latter part of the 1900s, and he died actually the latter part of the 1800s. He died in the year 1900. He made this comment. He said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." When you really have that drive, that sense to make a contribution, to do something that's useful to you, this is all from your own perception, then the hows don't matter. You'll find a way. And as we teach in this teaching of Science of Mind, we say over and over, and it's been borne out by the practice, our personal practice of many of us. Don't concern yourself so much with how you're going to accomplish something. Know what it is you want to accomplish. It's the universe's job to find the how. You remember the movie The Karate Kid? That was quite a number of years ago, and there was Mr. Miyagi, that's right, isn't it? Yeah. And Daniel. And there was a lot of exciting stuff in there, and to beat up the bad guys and all. But the one thing that I really remember about this that really impresses me was an interaction between Mr. Miyagi, the Japanese American, who he'd been in World War II, and a little conversation that went on between he and Daniel. And Daniel was watching him, that is Mr. Miyagi, at his hobby of shaping and growing these bonsai trees. And he finally occurred to Daniel, I really would like to do that myself. So he asked the old man about that, and he said, "Well, how do you do it?" And he reaches over and grabs a pair of scissors and hands it to them. "Hey, there's a plant. Go ahead and do it." How am I going to do this? And he starts trimming a little bit, and finally the boy looks at him and he says, "How do I know I'm doing it right?" And Mr. Miyagi says to him, "Close your eyes and get a picture of what it's going to look like and do it." So he closes his eyes, he opens his eyes, and he starts trimming. And then he says, "But Mr. Miyagi, how do I know my picture's right?" Isn't that like us many times? And Mr. Miyagi said, you will know it's right when it comes from your heart. If it comes from your heart, it must be right. Trust your picture. And I say to us, trust your picture. What picture? Trust the picture of who you are in the, metaphorically speaking, the sight of God. Begin to see yourself as you were created to be. There is something within you that knows the capability, the possibilities that exist for you. Something within you that has a sense of your innate talents, and we all have them. Now, how do you begin to come to that? Well, first of all, begin pay attention. What do you do and do well that you really like to do? One of the other things is to look at the people in your life that you really admire and emulate them. And I've done this for years. There are a couple of people I mentioned in the earlier service. There are a few others, but the two people in the last couple of years that I have really kind of latched onto. If I have an emotional, mental, mystical kind of board of trustees, these are two people that sit on it with me. And that's Peter Drucker, the great management guru, probably the greatest management consultant that the world has known, and another fellow whose name is William Cohen. And you probably never heard of him. But I began reading their stuff. I read Peter Drucker not because of his great management prowess, although that's fascinating to read about it, but who the man is, where he came from, how he approached life, what his ethics are, what his basic system for personal development is. And it inspires me. And this other fellow, William Cohen, is the same thing with this guy. And I won't go into their biographies, but I've read them. I study what they have written. I'm not saying that to emulate somebody, I'm going to imitate them, because I can only be who I am. But they can be an inspiration to me insofar as they have shown me a pattern to the way they do things, and that can begin to lead me. So find the people that you really admire and begin to emulate them in that way. The third of these three things, first was you gotta wanna, and then the second is you can change when you have something significant to give yourself to, and you can identify with others who seem to know where they're going. If indeed that appeals to you, you can discover yourself. And the third one is accept life on its own terms. Accepting life on its own terms, it really means to me seeing things as they are. Remember Walter Cronkite used to end his programs all the time with, and that's the way it is. Begin to look at things in terms of, is that really the way it is? Ask that question. Begin to be willing to accept the possibility that something that somebody else is presenting, even though it goes against the grain of the way you've thought all your life, may have something to offer. Accepting them doesn't mean that you're giving approval to what they have said or done, or the example they're providing. It doesn't mean that you're giving your consent, or you're condoning, or you're sanctioning, or you are in agreement with them. Not at all. You're not aiding or abetting. You may not even like what it is that they're talking about. But what you're doing is you're seeing things as clearly as possible for what they really are. And as you begin to work at doing this, it starts to clarify your thinking. It begins to make your path, your next moves, more obvious to you. It helps you to know in your own life if change is necessary. And it puts you in the position of being at choice. Otherwise, you're just locked into an old pattern and you see nothing except that old pattern. It gives you this ability to respond, known as responsibility. I want to read something to you in closing that comes out of the Science of Mind textbook written by Ernest Holmes. And I looked these things up the other day, and they are separated by that much text, the two, and they fit together. They could have been written side by side. No, I got the right page. Yes. This is Ernest speaking, and you need to know that when Ernest talks about God, he can use God, life, spirit, the all in all, all kinds, the thing itself, uses all kinds of terms. And that is because God is a concept you can't define. So he uses all these different connotations. And he uses life here in particular. All seeming change is merely the play of life upon itself. And all that happens must happen by and through some interaction upon itself. Yeah, remember the Gospel of John? In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. That's all there was. And then everything that was made as a result of the expression of that Word. This is this idea. Everything is a result of some kind of an interaction upon itself. What would be the nature of this interaction? It could not be physical, as we understand physics, but would have to be by the power of some inner movement of life. That is, the voice of God, God standing for the first, great, and only cause of all that is. There's only one thing that does it all. We call it God. And the next short couple of sentences is this. And I love this. Nature will not let us stay in any one place too long. She will let us stay just long enough to gather the experience necessary to the unfolding and advancement of the soul. You don't ever have it made, folks. There's always something more. Let's come to center, shall we? Let us know that there is a power and presence that surrounds us. There is this one thing that we call God. Everywhere we look, we see the expression of God. In every face, we see the face of God. God is all there is. And I am part of that, for I am made in its image and likeness as each one of you is. All are made in the image and likeness of God. Just be with that for a moment. Tell yourself, I'm made after the image of God. And therefore, all that God is, the peace and the power of God, the joy and the love of God, the intelligence and the creativity of God, the harmony and the balance of God, the abundance of God. This is the field within which I live, move, and have my being, and with which I am one. I am inseparable from all this good. And as I know this, I let go, I release. And I, Richard Impresher, right now affirm for everybody here that the very essence of God is flowing in and through everyone. This is a given. But what I also know is that there is an openness in everyone to the realization of that truth, of that essence. And lives are changed because of this. I accept that that is so. I know it is so. I am grateful that it is so. I rejoice that it is so. And I can honestly say, and so it is.